Hi, my name is Mason Soldridge, and in this video, I'll be going over my essay for Dr. Campbell's class. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Okay, so the essay is entitled The Spanish-American War, and the introduction goes as follows. At the start of the 20th century, the United States began to emerge as a global power, which was a direct result of American imperialism. The Spanish-American War and the subsequent Philippine-American War marked the beginning of a long-winded history of American imperialism, a tactic that the United States used to acquire new territories by occupying nations and asserting dominance over their native people while simultaneously promising them a better life. This tactic only serves as an example of the ends justify the means attitude and the superiority complex that is indoctrinated into Americans. The United States has had questionable values from its founding, and those same values, the ones that favored white skin and looked down on people of color, the same ones that found it right to force Native Americans off of their own land by any means necessary, were carried through to our Declaration of Independence, Constitution, our institutions, and all the way down to those individuals in our governing parties. The Spanish-American War and the subsequent Philippine-American War are two examples of when greed and nationalism become the driving force of a thriving nation. Though presented through sugar-coated propaganda of American empathy and heroism, these occupations of less fortunate nations were nothing more than a move for more power and economic gain. The true motives for these occupations were showcased through American attitudes and the consistent use of racial rhetoric. The rest of the essay goes through an analysis of the several primary sources that we were given, and the first primary source is the Sherman Report. Now, the Sherman Report was written by Jacob Gold Sherman to President William McKinley after the Americans had occupied the Philippines, and President William McKinley had created a commission to have boots on the ground and kind of analyze their standing institutions. But at this time, hostilities on the island between American soldiers and Filipinos were continuing to stew and eventually boil over. So a few of the quotes that I wanted to highlight in the Sherman Report was that first and foremost, it was made to seem like a huge act of American heroism, um, but it wasn't. And Andrew and Jacob Gold Sherman's report to the president actually presents a clear message about how deeply the American government and its leaders believed in their own cultural superiority. So they paint the Philippine occupation as America's moral destiny, and he backed this belief up by constantly using degrading rhetoric to paint the Filipinos as unintelligent and incapable people, to paint them as unintelligent and incapable people. And the most striking example of this imperial mindset is his main argument that the Filipino are not capable of self-government, and in order for their government not to collapse, they need American oversight. He says only through American occupation, therefore, is the idea of a free, self-governing, and united Philippines Commonwealth at all conceivable. And this just actually backs up the idea that the Americans truly believe that their culture and their way of doing things is superior. He even goes as far as referring to the American occupation as the American protectorate. He further goes on to claim that the performance of our national duty will prove to be the greatest blessing of the people of the Philippine Islands, which also just backs up this claim that the Americans truly believed in their own cultural superiority. And it wasn't just for helping the Philippines have this great life, which is what they phrased it as to the Filipino people. The language that he used and the way in which he portrayed American strength is an example of how deeply the American people felt their cultural superiority. But more than that, he goes on to he goes on to explain to President William McKinley over here the value of the islands, and that truly sheds light on the true motives behind the American occupation, which is power and economic gain. Because in that section, he goes on to talk about how the value of the islands and its placement and where it is in Asia will truly help Americans' economic power and economic gain and help them go on to be this true global power. Going off of that, another document that holds that very same sentiment is Albert Beveridge's defense of US imperialism. So in this document, he does kind of the same thing that Jacob Gold Sherman did. He explains that this American occupation, it's the Americans' moral destiny, and it's truly helpful for economic gain, and it's truly our role as an emerging global power to help these American people, I mean, to help the Filipino people, excuse me, because we are so much better than them, essentially. So, a few of the points in this document that I want to point out is that he used just blatantly racial language, and he used very racial rhetoric, and he very clearly painted these feelings of very blatant racial superiority, and that was used to defend the United States occupation of the Philippines. And just his language alone shows how superior that the Americans felt over the Philippines. They didn't even see each other as equal. So, um, Senator Albert J. Beveridge, in an effort to unify the nation against war, first argued that the Philippine Islands were of great necessity to the United States due to its location as a base at the door of all of the East. So this just goes to prove our original claim that the United States was not doing this as some moral destiny. It was because there was gain, there was economic gain. And um, Jacob, excuse me. And Jacob Gold Sherman also holds that same mindset. He goes on to argue that having occupying the Philippines would open so many new trade routes throughout Asia and especially through China's illimitable markets. And that makes this an opportunity that the United States must seize immediately to continue growing in the global market. His other main argument was that this was a divine mission sent to the United States by God. Now, in his argument, he actually weaponizes the United States belief of religion, and he says that this is God's destiny. This is God sent this mission to them because he decided that it is a task worthy of our strength and thanksgiving to Almighty God that he has marked us as his chosen people henceforth to lead in the regeneration of the world. His use of religion and nationalism just serves as another example of how deeply the American people felt their cultural superiority. And he used religion as leverage for imperialism. He goes on to claim that this is their moral responsibility. Moreover, Beveridge just chooses to argue his point by using blatantly racist rhetoric. He paints the Filipinos as savage, and he actually uses savage to describe the Filipino people. He likens them to children or to barbarians, while simultaneously claiming that this is the Americans' destiny and responsibility to guide them because Filipino people are too primitive to even understand a practical government. Meanwhile, he argued that God had been preparing the English-speaking people, the Americans, to be the master organizers of the world to establish systems where chaos reigns. and that he, God, has made them adept in government so that they may administer government among the most savage and senile peoples. The way that he chooses to portray the United States as saviors to the savage and senile Filipino people just serves as another example of the deep-rooted racial and cultural superiority of the American people. However, apart excuse me, apart from power and economic gain, deep-rooted shared beliefs of racial and cultural superiority were some of the main driving forces behind American imperialism in the Philippines. Americans just simply believed that they were better than them and that they deserved those islands because they know how to run a government, and the Philippines, that island, would just serve them a lot better. However, those individuals were not the whole voice of the government. And there were many people that disagreed with them. Henry Cabot Lodge, however, was another supporter of American imperialism, and he simply dismissed any arguments on the basis that the United States' traditional foreign policy of neutrality and the Monroe Doctrine had nothing to do with American expansions overseas, because anti-imperialists have been using the Monroe Doctrine and our foreign policy as a defense of the Americans should not be occupying all of these nations because it's against foreign policy. However, he dismissed any of those arguments and said that this was not traditional foreign policy and that we didn't have to remain neutral. Much like the Sherman Report and Albert Beveridge, Lodge used patriotism to justify his defense of American imperialism by stating that Washington himself saw the true course for the American people. Now, instead of using religion as leverage for imperialism, Lodge decided to use patriotism and nationalism as leverage for imperialism. He exclaimed that it was now the American people's duty to lead the world politically, economically, and morally. Much like Beveridge, Lodge also criticized the anti-imperialists as well because Lodge Beveridge criticized the anti-imperialists, and he says that they were just not being open enough to expanding overseas and fulfilling the divine prophecy that was set out before the United States. He argued that great nations everywhere were expanding and that the expansion is not only natural for the advancement of human race, but he states that as one of the great nations of the world, the States must not fall out of line. Once again, his appeal to patriotism and to expansion only further worked to justify his argument that the American invasion of the Philippines was a necessity for not only power, but for economic growth as well. But not all the American leaders, such as those few, shared the same sentiments. Charles G. Ames was an anti-imperialist who argued that imperialism threatened the very values that founded the United States. Ultimately, he argued that imperialism threatens to change the temper of our people and to put us into a permanent attitude of arrogance, testiness, and defiance towards other nations. He feared for what was going to happen in our future if we just got comfortable occupying and asserting dominance over other people. He stated that by becoming one more bully among nations of bullies, the United States would lose the character and humanity that this country prided itself on. Furthermore, William Jennings Bryan also shared the same sentiments in his speech, and he openly opposed the U.S. occupation of the Philippines and U.S. imperialism. He too argued that imperialism is a direct contradiction of America's founding principles and abhorrently rejects all the arguments that imperialists like Beveridge used in his claim for imperialism. He rebuts these claims by arguing that a war of conquest is as unwise as it is unrighteous, reminding others that governing those who do not want to be governed by the United States will only lead to a revolt, which eventually happened. Moreover, he directly argues against the claim that the Philippines is a necessary economic conquest by reminding the American people that the United States was a world power and already has been for some time. So that's just an empty claim. Um, Lastly, he ended with he believes that the true duty of the United States was to serve as a moral example for the Filipino people, and that trading the nation's moral ideals for economic gain would only be at the expense of nation's integrity. B.O. Flower, a journalist who wrote openly and bluntly about the torturous treatment of the Filipino people, also shared the same sentiment of the Filipino-American War. However, he did it in a completely different way because he openly wrote about the torture and the practices that American soldiers were inflicting upon Filipinos. And he stated that this was a complete disintegration of American values. This is a complete contradiction of what America was founded on and what they stated were their values. And he wrote about the brutal, unjustified torture that American soldiers are bringing upon the Filipino. And he calls to action the morality of the United States as a whole. He wants people to understand that the Filipino-American War was cruel, unjust, and essentially just a war of subjugation. The Americans lost their values in that war, he stated. He warned people. He also wanted to warn American citizens of what he witnessed, that an American soldier was tortured by his brothers and sisters. He was tortured, and he wanted to warn the American people that any government who can torture those who they're supposed to be helping will have no problem ultimately turning that cruelty on their own people. So all in all, in our American government, there was anti-imperialists and there were imperialists that claimed that the imperialists claimed that this occupation of the Philippines was absolutely necessary. However, they claimed that it was our moral destiny, that it was for the people of the Philippines. However, through these primary sources, you can see that that was not at all true. Through our own senator's words, our own American leaders' words, it shows that this was not just about helping the Filipino people and helping them have a democratic nation. This is for economic power and economic gain. The United States ultimately invaded and occupied the Philippines as a result of the dangerous combination of racist ideals, nationalism, and economic ambition. Though imperialists like Albert J. Beveridge, Henry Cabot Lodge, and Sherman framed the invasion of the Philippines as divine destiny and economic necessity, their use of skewed language and racial ideology in defense of their arguments served as a window into their true motives. The United States did not occupy the Philippines with the intention of helping the Filipino people. American leaders ultimately saw dollar signs in their eyes and a native group of people they thought were less than them due to deep-rooted racial and cultural superiority. Thank you.